Hello everyone. Today let's talk about being paranoid as a schizophrenic and how it can help you in your life. I am a schizophrenic, by the way. So being paranoid as a schizophrenic is kind of like it's feeling rather, like there is a web of eyes and ears all around you, very near, always listening to you, always watching you, always you are the central aspect. All of everything's senses around you is directed towards you and judging you. Judging you based on how you look, how you act, and imagining all the suppositions that lie therein. So, for the sake of this analogy, just imagine that you're in a kind of like a half dome, sitting on the ground, and your entire dome is made up of ears and eyes, all trying to sense you, all trying to hear you, all trying to look at you, and inherently judge you. That's what it's like to be paranoid as a schizophrenic. To feel like you are the central aspect, and the central aspect is being judged. The central aspect of the universe is being judged, and being watched, and being listened to. Now, that is a hard life to live. It is a hard reality to conjure up, let alone be a part of. But that's what schizophrenics experience. It's what we experience. So that's scary. What comes after is a little bit different. So I'm still schizophrenic, but after I overcame my paranoid delusions, I'm medicated, but there's something psychological that has to happen inside of you as well. It's just not all just about medication. There's something psychological that you have to understand as a schizophrenic. And you have to take apart your delusions one by one and remember what you learn by taking apart those delusions. Remember that nobody was looking at you. Nobody was listening to you. Nobody was judging you or making suppositions about you. That every encounter that you imagined was somebody trying to observe you in some way or judge you in some way was false. Didn't happen. Never happened. Not one time when somebody was looking at you or you thought was listening to you or you thought was judging you. Not one of those times was the paranoia correct. Not one of those times was it real. It was an imagined reality that we created. That's what paranoia is as a schizophrenic. And while that former reality sounds crazy, what comes afterward is also a little bit scary. So once you take apart those delusions, once you realize everybody you thought was looking at you, everybody that you thought was listening to you wasn't, and that it was just in your head. It was never real. Every single ear and eye that makes up the dome that is your existence, you being observed from every angle. Once you realize that, then they're all something else. They're all black holes linked only by one trait, commonality. Their common nature, in that they didn't exist. So, instead of eyes and ears and things observing you, listening to you, judging you, there is a void. Once you realize none of those ever happened, that didn't happen, none of those ever existed, and more importantly, none of it ever mattered, there is a void all around you. This blackness. And then, in that blackness, it's something more terrible than being observed or listened to. It's realizing that you're alone. Nobody was ever concerned about you or trying to judge you or listen to you or watch you. This whole time, you were alone. And you feel this void around you once you make that realization. That void is scary. Because for the first time, the only thing worse than being observed or listened to or judged is nobody ever was. And there's that black void around you. And you're left not with other people to conquer, because you never could, never should, and never had to. It's that void, that loneliness that you had to conquer all along, that was behind the veil of illusion, of delusion. It was that void, that loneliness that we've always had. That's what you had to conquer all along. Once all the illusions are stripped away, that's what you're left with, that void of nothingness. And you feel alone. And that's a whole nother level of evolution for somebody who's paranoid and a schizophrenic. But like I said, this applies very much to the average person as well. Let me give you an example of how this also applies to if perhaps all the delusions and illusions were legitimate. Historical even. Napoleon Bonaparte. So, his entire life, most of his life, he did have everybody watching him, everybody listening to him. He wasn't schizophrenic. But many different nations, several different nations, had to make 11 different coalitions at different times in order to defeat his one central position army. 11 different coalitions. It's almost like if the United States and its allies had to go to Iraq 11 times and they kept on getting defeated. He had so many eyes on him. His men, his generals, all of Europe's had all the eyes on him. And in the end, it wasn't supposed to. He couldn't conquer them all. Couldn't. And once again, this is a materialistically legitimate reason for paranoia. All the eyes were on him. There was never a chance of him conquering them all. And his punishment also leads into the second phase after paranoia for schizophrenics. So instead of killing him, England mainly, but Britain and its allies, Austria, Russia, certain elements of France, so on, they wanted to be a gentleman to him. I'm not sure it's because he was European and a well-known one and a very brilliant one or not, that they didn't just execute him. So the first time they exiled him in Elba, he came back, 1,000 men, turned that into 85,000 over several weeks by just going to different French garrisons after King Louis was installed. I can't remember which number comes after his name. The soldiers loved him. The French soldiers loved him. And one garrison after another he went to turned 1,000 men into about 87,000 without firing a shot. But eventually, as was inevitable, he was defeated by all the eyes. All the different nations, all different peoples. So he was exiled to, after Elba was the first one, St. Helena. And he got the worst. I don't know if they designed this, but this leads into, maybe because he was European and very intelligent, but he got the worst punishment for somebody like him. It wasn't to be executed, wasn't to die in battle. That would have been glorious. It was to live to death. To live so long that his name, his reputation, and who he was faded into obscurity. Until he was left with the same void to conquer. Even though all the eyes were real in his case, couldn't conquer him, but he didn't need to because it was never a possibility. But he was left with the same void of obscurity, of nobody caring anymore to conquer. Even when his fears and paranoia were legitimate, he was left with the same void to conquer. And that's the void that he faded into. And instead of conquering the void, he died after years of reminiscing of thinking what he could have done better, what he could have done right. If he just would have done this at this time, if he would have just had this victory or that victory, very much like our lives. If he would have just done things differently, everything would have turned out better. But that's not how you conquer the void. You don't conquer the void by thinking that you could have done something better in the world. You conquer the void by being you and it not mattering who anyone else is or what they're doing. If you can be you and be relevant to you and not make your whole reality based on who's looking at you, who's judging you, or your status in society, you can conquer the void. He was left with that void and he couldn't conquer it because everything that he was, everything that defined him was everyone else. And that's what being paranoid is as well. It's you defining your existence by other people's judgment, observation, hearing you, seeing you. All those eyes become death by 1,000 cuts, if you allow them to. Napoleon, when he had legitimate eyes, all looking at him, he was left with the same void in the end, after they were gone, when they were really gone, and because he defined himself by everyone else, or what they thought, he couldn't conquer the void, and the void swallowed him. So if you're paranoid, or if you're a paranoid schizophrenic, I guess I'm still classified that way in the books, no one was ever, even if there were a few, the reality that we have around us when we're paranoid, it doesn't exist. All those eyes and ears and judgments, they were always up here. They were never anywhere else. And then the second part is scarier, when that void surrounds you and you realize you were all alone all along. And the void was always the thing you were going to have to conquer.